The gunshot was the first thing. It cracked across the plains like a whip, and Clara dropped the water bucket. Water splashed over her worn leather boots, turning the dust to instant mud. Her hands didn't even think. They just moved, grabbing the rifle propped against the fence. The Texas sun was a cruel, white eye in the sky. It bleached the world to shades of brown and pale yellow. The heat shimmered off the ground, making the horizon dance and warp. Seeing anything past 50 yards was a fool's game, but she could hear it. Hoofbeats, pounding the life out of the dry earth. Men shouting, their voices thin and mean on the wind. Another gunshot, closer this time. Clara was 20 years old. She'd been alone on this scrap of land for 8 months, ever since the fever took her father. The crops were dead. The last 2 cows were walking skeletons. She had $4.30 hidden in a tin can under the floorboards. Every single morning, she woke up with a cold knot in her stomach, wondering if this was the day the bank finally came to take it all away. But fear was a luxury. It was for people who still had something left to lose. And that's when she saw him. A rider, hunched low on a black horse slick with sweat and foam. He was hurt. She could see it even from this distance, the way he clutched his side, the way his body swayed with every exhausted stride of the animal. Behind him, 3 more riders. They wore bandanas over their faces, and they weren't aiming to kill. Not yet. They were playing with him, firing into the air, enjoying the terror. Clara knew the type. Vultures on horseback. They took what they wanted and left nothing behind but ghosts and shallow graves. The injured man saw her cabin. It wasn't much, a shack, a leaning barn, a busted fence. But to him, it must have looked like a fortress. He changed course, pushing his horse straight for her. Clara raised the rifle to her shoulder. The stock felt familiar, solid. Her father had taught her to shoot before he taught her to read. A woman alone in this territory, he'd said, needs to be more dangerous than the men who come knocking. The black horse stumbled as it reached her fence line, nearly throwing its rider. He held on, just barely. Up close, the damage was worse. Blood soaked his shirt, a dark, spreading stain. His face was all harsh lines and sun-baked leather. A man at least 15 years older than her, but his eyes, they were sharp, clear and desperate. He pulled the horse to a stop, the animal's sides heaving. He looked at Clara, at the rifle aimed at his chest, and his gaze was so intense, it felt like a physical weight. The bandits were closing in. She had maybe 30 seconds. The man's voice was a rough, painful rasp. Please. Just one word, but it held the weight of a man's entire life. In the space of a single heartbeat, Clara made a choice. Her father had raised her to help folks, especially when it cost something. Especially when it might cost everything. She lowered the rifle just an inch and jerked her head toward the barn. Get inside. Take the horse. Stay quiet. He didn't waste a second on thanks. He slid from the saddle with a pained grunt and limped into the dark maw of the barn, pulling the trembling horse behind him. Clara watched him vanish. Then she turned, planted her feet in the dirt in front of the barn door, and raised her rifle again. This time, her aim was steady. This time, it was pointed directly at the heart of the man in the lead. The 3 riders pulled up, their horses snorting and stamping in a cloud of dust. They were young, not much older than her, but their eyes were ancient, cold and empty. The leader, a man with a jagged scar that split his face from eye to jaw, pulled down his bandana. "We're looking for a man," he said, his voice a low growl. "On a black horse. You seen him?" Clara's grip on the rifle was white-knuckle tight. "Haven't seen anyone. You're on my property. Leave." The scarred man, Miguel, let out a dry chuckle that had no humor in it. "Your property?" he sneered, looking at the withered cornstalks in the dilapidated cabin. "Lady, this patch of dirt ain't worth the nails in your boots. Now where is he?" "I told you," Clara said, her voice flat and cold as a winter stone. "I haven't seen anyone." One of the others, a twitchy, nervous man, spurred his horse forward. "She's lying, Miguel. I saw him ride this way. He's got to be in there." Miguel's eyes narrowed, studying her. He was doing the math. A woman alone, even with a rifle, wasn't much of a threat. But there was something in the way she stood, the way the weapon was an extension of her arm, that made him pause. He was used to fear. He didn't see any in her eyes. He saw something else, something that made him uncomfortable. Finally, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We'll be back," he snarled, wheeling his horse around. "And if we find out you're lying, you're gonna pray for a quick death." Clara didn't move. She watched them ride away until they were nothing but small, dark specks swallowed by the heat haze. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She turned and walked into the cool darkness of the barn. The man was slumped against the far wall. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood. His horse stood nearby, its head hanging low. "They're gone," Clara said. "For now." He looked up, and for the first time, she saw something besides pain in his face. It was respect. "You didn't have to do that." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." She set her rifle down and knelt beside him, gently pulling his torn shirt away from the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, just above his hip. It was bad, but it could have been worse. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice all business as she stood to fetch clean rags and the whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. He hesitated for a long moment. "James." "Well, James," she said, returning with the supplies, "you picked a hell of a day to get shot on my land." She worked quickly, cleaning the wound. He didn't make a sound, not even when she poured the raw whiskey over the torn flesh. His jaw was a block of granite, his knuckles white where he gripped a handful of hay, but his lips were sealed tight. When she was done bandaging him, she sat back on her heels and really looked at him. Under the grime and blood, his clothes were expensive. Fine cotton shirt, custom leather boots. Even the gun belt he'd set aside was high-quality work. This wasn't some drifter. "You're not from around here," she stated. It wasn't a question. "No." "And those men?" James met her gaze. "They think I have something that belongs to them." "Do you?" "Yes." Clara appreciated the honesty. "Are they coming back?" "Probably." She nodded. That much was obvious. Men like that didn't just give up. Not when something valuable was on the line. And whatever this man was carrying, it was valuable. "Can you ride?" she asked. "Not far. Not like this." "Then you're staying here," she said. "But I'm not dying for a stranger until I know the whole truth. So you're going to tell me. Everything." James studied her face, his sharp eyes weighing, measuring. He was trying to decide if she was a bigger risk than the men hunting him. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "I own a ranch," he said, his voice low. "The Double T, up near the Red River." Clara almost laughed. Everyone in Texas had heard of the Double T Ranch. It wasn't just big. It was an empire. Hundreds of thousands of acres, tens of thousands of cattle. The man who owned it was a legend, a ghost, richer than a king. She looked at this bleeding man in her dusty barn. "Sure you do," she said, a bitter smile touching her lips. "And I'm the Queen of England." But James wasn't smiling. He reached into his vest with his good hand and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he produced a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. It was a deed. Signed, notarized, bearing the official seal of the Texas Land Office. The legal description of the property went on for 3 paragraphs, a sprawling kingdom of townships and ranges. And at the bottom, in clear, bold letters, was the name, James Robert Thornton, sole owner. She read it 3 times. It was real. The paper, the seal, the signature. It was all real. This bleeding, broken man in her barn was one of the wealthiest men in the entire country. But that just made things stranger. "Why is the owner of the Double T Ranch being chased by 3 backwater bandits?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I was returning from a meeting in San Antonio," James said. "They ambushed me 2 days ago, killed my men, took my horses and a strongbox." "What was in the box?" $20,000 in cash and securities. Clara's mind reeled. $4.30. $20,000. The numbers didn't even seem to belong to the same world. But James wasn't finished. "The money doesn't matter," he said, and his eyes grew dark. "The box also contained documents, papers for a land deal. If those papers fall into the wrong hands, I lose everything." This wasn't just a robbery. This was something else entirely. An attack. A calculated strike. "They'll be back," she said, handing him the deed. "With more men. They'll tear this place apart." "I know. So what's the plan?" James looked at her, and she saw the mask of the wounded man fall away. In its place was the Cattle King, the empire builder, the survivor. "I need to get to Fort Worth," he said. "I have people there, but I can't ride for at least 3 days. If you hide me, if you keep me alive, I'll make it worth your while." Clara let out a short, harsh laugh. "I don't have a choice, do I? If I throw you out, they'll know I lied. They'll burn this place to the ground out of spite." "Probably," James admitted. "You're in this now, whether you like it or not. But I'm still offering to pay." "How much?" she asked, the question tasting like ash in her mouth. "How much do you need?" The question hung in the air. She thought of her father's debts, the failing farm, the $4. $200, she said, the amount feeling impossibly large, enough to save her home. "Done," James said without hesitation. Then his face hardened. "But you need to understand, these men are professionals. When they come back, it's going to be a war. Are you prepared for that?" Clara thought of her father's dying words. "Be strong. Fight for what's yours." She picked up her rifle. "Yes," she said. "I'm prepared." The next 3 days passed in a haze of tension. Clara tended to James's wound, fed him broth from her meager supplies, and kept a constant, sleepless watch. James healed with an unnatural speed. By day 3, the fever was gone, and he could walk without stumbling. They talked. He told her how he'd built his empire from nothing, starting with just a few hundred acres and a stubborn refusal to fail. "I was your age when I started," he'd said, broke and angry at the world. She saw a flicker of herself in his story. She told him about her own struggles, about the debt and the drought. "Why do you stay?" he asked. "This land was my father's," she said, her voice fierce. "And his father's before him. My grandmother is buried under that oak tree on the hill. This place is all I have left. I won't just walk away." James looked at her for a long time. "You remind me of myself," he said quietly. But as they talked, Clara noticed something strange. For a man running for his life, he didn't seem panicked. He seemed calculating. He asked questions about her land. Not just the farm, but the layout of the hills, the location of the creek, the depth of the well. It was odd. It felt less like curiosity and more like reconnaissance. A cold seed of doubt began to sprout in her mind. Was he telling her the whole truth? Was it just a land deal they were after? Or was it something else? Something he wasn't saying. On the morning of the 4th day, the doubt turned to ice. She woke to the sound of horses. Not 3 this time. Many more. She ran to the window. Miguel was back, and he'd brought an army. At least a dozen men, all armed to the teeth, sat on horseback in her yard. They weren't here to ask questions this time. "I know he's in there, girl!" Miguel roared, his scarred face twisted in a triumphant grin. "Send him out, and we might let you live." James was already on his feet, his gun belt strapped on, a revolver in his hand. The look on his face wasn't fear. It was anticipation. "How many shots you got?" he asked, his voice calm. "5 in the rifle, 6 in my pistol." "I've got 6 in this one, and my rifle's on my saddle with 6 more." He did the quick math. 23 shots, against 12 men. I've seen worse odds. But before Clara could answer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Riding next to Miguel wasn't another bandit. It was a man in a crisp suit, mounted on a fine gray mare, and pinned to his chest was a sheriff's badge. The law wasn't coming to save them. The law was here to help the killers. The man with the badge dismounted, walking forward with an easy confidence. He stopped 20 feet from the cabin door and tipped his hat. "Clara Hayes," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "Sheriff Miller, there's a warrant out for the man you're hiding, James Thornton, for murder." Clara froze. She looked back at James. His face was a mask of stone. He hadn't told her. He hadn't said a word about being a wanted man. "He's a liar and a killer, miss," Sheriff Miller continued, his smile never reaching his eyes. "He murdered his business partner a week ago. Just hand him over, and we can forget this whole misunderstanding." Everything was a lie. The story about the ambush, the land deal, it had all been a performance. She had harbored a murderer. She had pointed her rifle at the law for him. "Is it true?" she whispered to James, her voice shaking. James didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the men outside. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" she hissed. "They're saying you're a murderer." Outside, Miguel was getting impatient. "Enough talk. We're coming in." The sheriff held up a hand. "Just a moment, Miguel. Let's give the lady a chance to be sensible." He looked back at the cabin. "Last chance, Miss Hayes. Don't throw your life away for him." Clara's world was spinning. Who was this man? What had she gotten herself into? She had two choices: hand over a potential killer to a corrupt sheriff and his gang of thugs, or fight alongside a man she didn't know, a man who had lied to her from the moment he arrived. James finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were pleading. "They're the liars, Clara, not me. Miller works for the man who wants me dead. Whatever you think I am, they're worse." The sheriff's smile faded. "All right, then." He drew his pistol. "Have it your way." That was all the warning they got. James moved to the window, motioning for her to take the door. "Don't let them through," he said, "and don't stop shooting until it's over." Clara took her position behind an overturned table, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't just fighting for him anymore. She was fighting for her own life. They knew she'd lied. They wouldn't leave a witness. The world outside exploded in gunfire. Bullets ripped through the thin wooden walls of the cabin, splintering wood and shattering the few remaining panes of glass. The air filled with acrid smoke. James fired from the window, his shots measured and precise. A rider fell from his horse. Clara fired through a crack in the door, hitting one of Miguel's men in the leg. He screamed and went down. The fight was a blur of noise and chaos. It lasted for 5 minutes that felt like 5 years. She reloaded her pistol, her hands moving on pure instinct. The cabin was a death trap, smoke burning her lungs, the roar of the guns deafening. When a lull in the shooting came, James crawled over to her. "They're trying to flank us," he hissed, "going for the barn. They think they can burn us out." Clara looked at the back wall of the cabin. She knew what was there. A loose section of planks her father had always meant to fix. It was their only way out. "Follow me," she said. They scrambled through the opening, emerging into the relative quiet behind the cabin. The main gunfight was still focused on the front. They sprinted for the cover of a small ravine that cut through her property. But they weren't fast enough. Sheriff Miller was waiting for them. He must have anticipated their move. He stood there, pistol raised, that same cold smile on his face. "Nowhere left to run, Thornton," he said. But before he could fire, a shot rang out from a different direction. Miller grunted, a red flower blooming on his chest. He staggered back, his eyes wide with surprise, and then collapsed into the dust. Clara and James spun around. Standing on the ridge above them was a figure they didn't recognize. An old man, weathered and tough, holding a long-barreled rifle. The old man scrambled down the ridge. "Get moving," he grunted. "The rest of them will be on you in a minute." "Who are you?" James asked, stunned. "A friend," the old man said. "Now are you going to stand here jawing, or are you going to live?" They didn't need to be told twice. They followed the old man deep into the rocky hills behind Clara's farm, the sounds of the gunfight slowly fading behind them. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed in protest. Finally, they reached a hidden cave, its entrance obscured by a thicket of thorny bushes. Inside, the old man lit a lantern. His name was Silas, and he was a former ranch hand for the Double T. He was loyal to James. "Heard Miller and his new friends were asking about you in town," Silas explained. "Figured you'd need a hand." "Miller? He was on their payroll," James said, finally catching his breath. "The whole county is bought and paid for." "Who?" Clara demanded, her voice hard. "Who wants you dead so badly they'd buy a sheriff?" James finally looked at her, his face grim. The time for half-truths was over. "His name is Marcus Thorne," James said. "He wasn't my business partner. He was my brother. And I didn't murder him." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Brother. "Thorne was my mother's name," James explained. "Marcus always preferred it. He was my half-brother, really. My father had him before he married my mother. We built the Double T together from the ground up. I was the cattleman. He was the businessman, the one who made the deals in the cities." "What happened?" Clara asked, her anger slowly being replaced by a dawning understanding. "He got greedy," James said, his voice laced with a deep, old pain. "He started making deals behind my back, selling off land rights to the railroad for a fraction of their worth, pocketing the difference. He was leveraging the ranch, taking out massive loans against it. He was going to gut the whole operation and leave me with the debt. So, those documents, they weren't for a land deal," James confirmed. "They're the proof. Ledgers, contracts, signed affidavits from men he cheated. Everything I need to prove he was committing fraud on a massive scale, to expose him and save my ranch." "And the murder charge?" "A week ago, I confronted him," James said. "I told him I knew everything. We fought. He pulled a gun on me. It went off in the struggle. He died. It was self-defense, but he had already paid off Miller. It was the perfect setup. The grieving brother, murdered for his share of the fortune. They put out the warrant and sent Miguel to hunt me down and get those papers before I could get to the federal marshal in Fort Worth." Suddenly it all made sense. The desperation, the lies, the army of hired guns. This wasn't about $20,000. It was about an empire worth millions. "So, what now?" Silas asked. "Now," James said, his eyes hardening with a new resolve. "We take back what's mine." But Clara was thinking about something else. Before he died, her father had been a bookkeeper for some of the smaller ranches in the area. He'd sometimes travel for days, working on their accounts. One of the names she remembered him mentioning, with a strange mix of fear and contempt, was Marcus Thorne. She remembered her father coming home one night, pale and shaken. He'd burned a stack of papers in their fireplace, telling her it was just old accounts, but he'd been jumpy for weeks afterward. "My father," Clara said slowly, a horrifying suspicion taking root in her mind. "He knew Marcus Thorne." James stared at her. "What?" "He did bookkeeping for him a few times, right before he got sick." She looked at James, her eyes wide. "The fever, it came on so suddenly, the doctor couldn't explain it." A terrible silence filled the cave. The fever hadn't been a fever. Her father hadn't died of an illness. He had seen something in Thorne's books, something he wasn't supposed to see, and they had silenced him. This wasn't James's fight anymore. It was hers. They had murdered her father. They had left her orphaned and destitute. They had tried to take everything from her. The fire in Clara's eyes was no longer just about survival. It was about vengeance. "They're not just going to give up," Silas warned. "They'll have the whole territory crawling with men looking for you." "We won't go where they're looking," James said, a plan already forming in his mind. "We're not going around the Brazos Mountains. We're going through them." It was a suicidal plan. The Brazos were a treacherous range of peaks and canyons, a place where even experienced trackers got lost and never came out. But it was their only chance. No one would expect them to take that route. For the next week, they traveled through the unforgiving wilderness. Silas, who had hunted in these mountains his whole life, was their guide. They ate what they could catch and slept in hidden crevices, always cold, always hungry, always looking over their shoulders. During the grueling journey, the walls between Clara and James came down. He saw the steel in her, the unyielding strength that had kept her alive on her own. She saw the burden he carried, not just for his ranch, but for the brother he'd been forced to kill. They were no longer a rancher and a farm girl. They were two survivors, bound by a shared enemy. One evening, huddled around a tiny, smokeless fire, James pulled the deed to his ranch from his wallet. He looked at it for a long time. "When this is over," he said, his voice quiet, "the $200 I promised you, it's not enough." "We had a deal," Clara said. "Deals change," he replied. He looked at her, his eyes serious in the flickering firelight. "You didn't just save my life. You fought beside me. You lost your home because of me. And your father. Clara, I can't fix that, but I can make sure you never have to worry about a thing for the rest of your life." He took out a pen and a second blank document from his wallet. A bill of sale. Using a flat rock as a desk, he began to write. He was giving her a piece of the double T, not just land, a 10% stake in the entire operation. It was a fortune beyond her wildest dreams. "I can't take this," she whispered, stunned. "You're not taking it," he said, not looking up from his writing. "You've earned it." Their journey ended in a dusty town on the far side of the mountains. They were battered, thin, and wearing rags, but they were alive, and they had the documents. But their enemies were smarter than they'd realized. As they walked down the main street, looking for a livery to get fresh horses for the final ride to Fort Worth, Clara saw a familiar face. It was the twitchy-eyed bandit from Miguel's crew, the one who had insisted she was lying. He was standing outside the telegraph office. He saw them at the same moment. His eyes widened, and he ducked back inside. "It's a trap," James breathed. "They knew we'd come this way. How could they have known? It didn't make sense. Unless they had another man on the inside. Someone other than Miller. Silas." Clara's head snapped around to look at the old man, but he was already moving. He wasn't running with them. He was drawing his pistol, aiming it straight at James. "I'm sorry, boss," Silas said, his face a mask of regret. "Thorne. He offered me enough to set me up for life. More than you ever paid me." The betrayal was swift and brutal. James stared at the man he had trusted, his face pale with shock. "He has my family, James," Silas whispered, his hand trembling. "He said he'd kill them if I didn't help." Before anyone could react, Clara moved. She didn't have her rifle, but she had the heavy iron skillet from their camp supplies tied to her pack. She swung the pack with all her might, catching Silas square in the side of the head. The old man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. But it was too late. Men were pouring out of the surrounding buildings. Miguel was at their head, his scarred face alight with triumph. They were surrounded. "Nowhere to run, Thornton," Miguel snarled, leveling his revolver at James's chest. "Give me the papers." James clutched the leather satchel containing the documents. This was it. The end of the line. They were out of options, out of time, and outgunned 20-1. Then, a new voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Miguel." The voice came from the end of the street. A tall, imposing man in a dark suit walked toward them, flanked by 4 more men with rifles. They weren't bandits. They were professionals, Pinkerton agents. The man in the suit held up a badge. "U.S. Marshal John Corrigan. Drop your weapons. All of you." Miguel hesitated, his eyes darting between the marshals and James. "It's over," Corrigan said, his voice like iron. "We got your telegraph message an hour ago." James and Clara exchanged a look of confusion. They hadn't sent a telegraph. Corrigan looked past them, toward the telegraph office. The twitchy-eyed bandit was being led out in handcuffs by another agent. "Turns out," Marshal Corrigan said with a grim smile, "Mr. Thorne wasn't paying some of his men enough. This one decided a federal reward, and a clean slate was a better deal." Miguel let out a roar of fury and fired his pistol, not at James, but at the traitor. The shot went wide as the marshals opened fire. The street erupted into a final, bloody gunfight. When the smoke cleared, Miguel and his men were dead. Marshal Corrigan walked over to James. "I believe you have some documents for me, Mr. Thornton." James handed over the satchel. It was finally over. 3 weeks later, Clara stood on a hill overlooking the Double T Ranch. It was a kingdom. As far as the eye could see, there was rolling grassland, dotted with thousands of cattle. The main ranch house was a mansion, bigger than the entire town she'd grown up in. James had been cleared of all charges. Marcus Thorne's network of corruption was being dismantled, piece by piece. The double T was safe. Clara now owned 10% of all of it. She was, on paper, one of the wealthiest women in Texas. James rode up beside her, reining in his horse. He had changed. The haunted look was gone from his eyes. He looked younger, more at peace. "It's a lot to take in," he said. "You could say that," she replied, her voice quiet. "I meant what I said," he told her. "What I wrote on that bill of sale. This is your home now, if you want it." She thought of her father's tiny, failing farm, the dust, the debt, the loneliness. Then she looked at this vast, thriving empire. But it wasn't the wealth or the land that held her there. It was the man beside her. They had been through fire together. They had seen the worst of each other and the best. "What about you, James?" she asked, turning to face him. "What do you want?" He looked at her, and his gaze was steady and clear. It held the same intensity she'd seen that first day, but the desperation was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something she was almost afraid to name. "I spent 20 years building this place," he said slowly. "I thought it was all that mattered. But running for my life, I realized something. An empire is just dirt and cows if you have no one to share it with." He reached out and took her hand. His was calloused and strong. Hers was too. "I'm not a man for fancy words, Clara," he said. "But I know what I see. I see a partner, not just in business, in everything." She looked from his hand, holding hers, to the endless horizon. She had started this journey with $4 and a rifle, expecting to die alone in the dust. Now, the whole world was spread out before her. She had protected a stranger, and in doing so, had uncovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. She had avenged her father and reclaimed a future she never knew she had. The poor farmer's daughter was now a cattle queen, and her greatest adventure was just beginning. What do you think happened next for Clara and James? Their story proves that sometimes a single act of courage can change your destiny forever. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of the Old West, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more incredible stories you won't find anywhere else.